Good morning. Welcome to the Eastman Financial Report. I'm Dan Eastman, your host, and today is amazingly Tuesday, July 29th, 2025. How quickly this year is peeling by, and of course, how quickly our summer is fading into late summer. And we've had an amazing year so far, an amazing economy to talk about, and certainly a lot of financial and economic news. And that's why I appreciate your viewership here at the Eastman Financial Report. It gives me an opportunity to share my thoughts and opinions with you, thoughts and opinions and skill set developed over teaching economics and finance for over 9 years as a college professor, and happy to bring that to the air. And that was the whole purpose of the Eastman Financial Report when I started broadcasting about 2.5 years ago. It was March of 2023 when we said, let's take the idea of a college economics lecture and bring it to the airwaves. And a lot of people said, well, you'll put people to sleep for half an hour. And I said, no, I think I can make it interesting enough that they'll tune in. So thank you so much for tuning in. I do appreciate it, and to be able to share critical thinking skills when we look at financial and economic information and try to make sense of it, because all of us in the American economy, we're trying to read the tea leaves and figure out, is the economy going up or down, inflation, this and that. It's good to do that with a critical eye, and that takes the ability to look at things from different perspectives and synergize those perspectives so that you can create a better worldview. And of course, that's what we do here at WTV, which is Worldview Tube and Worldview Radio. We bring information of the day to that great marketplace of ideas from a Christian perspective. And that's very important. That's our ministry here. That's our mission, our goal, our passion, is to look at what's happening in the economy and in the national political sphere and the international sphere. How does that look from a Christian perspective? And then we bring that perspective to that great cacophony of noise, which is the marketplace of ideas. And of course, we know, if you listen to me from time to time, you realize that the information marketplace is ever expanding. Now, you've made a choice. This is an economic choice. From 11:30 to 12 Central Time, Monday through Friday, I broadcast from the great metropolis of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I bring forth this Christian perspective on financial and economic news. And you have lots of choices. I'm sure there's lots of news being broadcast from 11:30 to 12, but you're here watching this. And of course, you're not paying a paywall. That's an interesting thing. This is information freely given. And that's part of our ministry here at Worldview Tube, is to bring our Christian perspective to that great marketplace of idea free of charge, just like the apostles did 2,000 years ago, when Saints Peter and Paul were moving around the Middle East sharing the gospel. They didn't charge admission. That wasn't some sort of a circus coming to town where you bought a ticket and went into here. No, this was an information given from a Christian perspective. And here we are 2,000 years later, still doing that same thing. And that's why, if you'd like to help Worldview Tube and Worldview Radio continue in this ministry, you can do that. And it's easy to do. You just go to worldviewfoundation.com and make a donation. Here's the website on the bottom of the screen. It says www.foundation.com, or worldviewfoundation.com takes you to the same place. And you can make a one-time donation, and that certainly helps us keep this information flowing freely throughout the day. You can use the QR code, scan it with your cell phone, it'll take you right to the website. And you can make a one-time donation, which we're always thankful for, or you can sign up for multiple or repeat donations. And what that does is it allows us to flatten our revenue curve so we can better match costs to revenues, keep our bottom line positive so we can continue to offer this information free of charge to the great marketplace of ideas. It can also help us out by doing business with the companies you see advertising throughout the day on our network. Now, we don't sell blocks of advertising time or companies create ads and run them. We partner with companies that we know and trust, and they offer goods and services to you, our viewers. And when you purchase goods or services, please know that a small portion of that comes back to the worldviewtube.com, Worldview Tube, in the form of a commission. And that allows us to continue our ministry as well. There's a third way that you can help out, and this is kind of cool. If you go to worldviewtube.com/vault, and I think the number will come up on the screen. Here it is, worldviewtube.com/vault. You can subscribe, and there's a little pay involved. You can subscribe to the vault, and within that vault is an amazing collection of Brandon Howe's ministerial works that go back over 20 years. He's written a number of very important books, and at conferences, seminars, videos of all of those conferences and seminars. It's all within the vault for you to view in on demand. Basically, if you're like me, you're up at 2 o'clock in the morning staring at the ceiling. You can go into the vault and you can see some really great content, and it's very much worth your while. We also have interviews with some great Christian thought leaders in the vault that are very, very important, not only because they're of the substance of their thoughts, again, in the third marketplace of ideas, but of course, some of these great minds have now gone to join the Lord in heaven, and we have captured their words for posterity. So it's a beautiful thing to be able to go and listen to Christian thought leaders from a bygone era, and we have their words captured in perpetuity. Wouldn't it be grand if we had Martin Luther's words, a video of Martin Luther, or Calvin or Zwingli, the great Protestant Reformation leaders, or even Catholic leaders back in the day? Well, we don't. Obviously, there weren't digital technology or electric systems, but we do have thoughts today, and that's why the vault is valuable. So valuable, you can even see reruns of the Eastman Financial Report inside the vault. So if you'd like to call me out or catch me on one of my statements, you subscribe to the vault and you can watch my videos and you can try to catch me, but good luck. So anyway, those are the three ways to help Worldview TV: is basically make a donation, do business with the fine companies that advertise on our channel, our network, and sign up for the vault, or do all three. That's even better. But in any event, we appreciate first and foremost your viewership. And then secondly, the support you give us in keeping this ministry alive and fresh and very important and meaningful in the great marketplace of ideas. Well, let's jump to the news, and a lot of news there is. It's one of those things in the late dog days of summer. The economy and politics tends to slow down a little bit, but there is some interesting news today that I want to talk about. And one of these things is historical. And, if you've watched my show, you understand that I always talk about economics from a historical perspective. That was my great seminal class as a college professor. It was economic history. And keep in mind, economics is a social science, and it's with a lot of math involved. But it's nonetheless, what we look at is the social history and things that are. If you look at the economy, you have to have an understanding of where we were in the past and how we got to where we are today in order to have any inkling of what the future looks like. And of course, nobody can predict the future. I always talk about my magic crystal ball. Obviously, you can see half of it's missing. It's only right half of the time. It's a joke. It's not right ever. You can't predict the future. But by understanding the past, you will be able to understand better where we are and why we're here right now. So that's why I'm very interested in economic history, because it's a telling thing. If you look at the Federal Reserve, created in 1913, that was before electricity, before telephones, before automobiles for the most part. And we're still using the same tools this many years later. And as I point out, with $37 trillion in debt and $2.5 trillion in deficit, operating deficit, the monetary tools of the Federal Reserve may not work so well. And that's one of the issues that I've been talking about for 2 years. And now other commentators are finally catching up and saying the same thing. And that's good. This is not a competitive world in academia and in this great marketplace of ideas. You really want to listen to voices, and then the voices shape your opinion to whatever degree you allow them to do that. And that's why if you have more voices, it's better than if you're listening to one news outlet or one channel. You're getting one set of data, and then you begin to parrot what they want you to say. It's very important to listen to a lot of sources. And that's why when I do make suggestions like I was talking about why housing prices are up when demand is down, or even in this instance, it's important to be able to hear multiple voices. And that's why when other voices start to parrot, that's a good thing. From an intellectual perspective, that's a good thing. It's not somebody, show prepping off of somebody's back. It's a consensus is forming. And the consensus, of course, is that the federal tools, maybe they don't work so well when you got $37 trillion in debt, because nobody could count that high in 1913. I mean, $100 in your pocket was a fortune. Well, $100 in your pocket today might get you a tank of gas and a trip to the grocery store if you're careful. So the point is, times change. Information is important, and you have to be able to read it. So long lead in, the great story, which is kind of cool, and I'm not sure what the relevance of the story is, but there's a history in the making. And of course, the United States, we're approaching our 250th year next year. It's going to be a great, great big party. But we have gone from a colonial enclave on the East Coast to the Monroe Doctrine, and from sea to shining sea, that this is the United States of America. And in the beginning, with the Industrial Revolution, emerged the steam engine, and of course, locomotives and trains, and the railroad business back in the 1800s was very much like the digital and dot-com businesses of today. It was the thing, and capital just poured into developing railroads that would connect places in the United States to central markets. I live 90 miles north of Chicago, and Chicago was the hub of the Midwest. I mean, from St. Louis and, from Ohio and Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, everything funneled into Chicago as a hub. And the same thing happened, of course, in New York with Grand Central Station and other hubs around the country. And there were many, many players in the railroad space. I mean, if you had some money and some buddies and your buddy was the governor, you get yourself a charter. And lo and behold, you got yourself a railroad, and a lot of railroads were built, and a lot of railroads went broke, and towns that didn't get a railroad went broke, and towns that did get a railroad station boomed into the metropolis of Milwaukee and other fine places. All of that happened as part of the build out of the railroad. And of course, there was a really big deal back in Promontory Point, Utah, when they were able to pound the golden stake and connect the West Coast to the East Coast so that you could take a train from New York and get to California. That was really cool. But you were always traveling on other people's railroads. They weren't unified and systematic. And we don't have, theoretically, we don't have central planning here in the United States. And we never had a national build out with federal dollars of a national railroad system like they do in the UK and other places, like the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia. Never had that. We had just a hodgepodge of capital, much of it inefficiently invested, that created a hodgepodge network of railroads that somehow managed to connect from sea to shining sea. The big news today is that for the first time in American history, and this is pretty cool because this is American history, we now have the merger of the Union Pacific and the Norfolk Southern Railroad. And when those two become one company, for the first time in American history, you're going to have one company that owns a railroad path from sea to shining sea, all under one company. And that's pretty cool because it's efficiency, it's the use of capital, and class. This will be on the quiz. What else do we see? Monopoly, right? When you have one company that controls transportation from sea to shining sea, especially in this day of shipping things from Europe and China and all come in, then this is an interesting problem. So we're celebrating this milestone in American history where one company will finally control sea to shining sea. And rest assured, there will be concerns when it comes to how do you price the service on that. If you're the only company that can do that, you get to charge a premium, and that starts to look like monopoly power, monopoly pricing. We'll see. It's a very competitive industry, and certainly the trucking industry has always kept the railroads on its toes. Not only that, but sometimes air freight. And then again, shipping, if you can figure out how to get through the Panama Canal, which we may or may not still have control of, that's all factored in. But it's a cool story. It's a really great story that, finally, here we are, 2025. We are going to have one company controlling one pathway across the great United States from sea to shining sea. That's an $85 billion deal, by the way. It's a very expensive deal. It's 50,000 miles of track, which is really interesting. And it'll connect New Jersey to California. Wow, that's amazing. But we'll see. It's a fun thing. You think we were talking yesterday and the last week about the monopoly power of electrical utilities. And of course, that's why they're regulated. Now, I'm not advocating we regulate the railroad companies. They're pretty well regulated to begin with. But the point is, from an economic perspective, does this standardize the transportation of goods and services across the country at a time when we're looking at tariffs that are stimulating the growth of manufacturing in the United States? You're building stuff in the middle, you have to get it to the coasts. This could be a great asset for the U.S. And I'm not alleging any monopoly things here, but there's always this interesting question: how big is too big? And that will be sorted out. But I think for the good news, this is good news right now. Good news tends to become, questionable down the road, but we have not gone down that road. So happy to announce that big merger. That's pretty cool. Interestingly, one of the consumer companies that are very large, I was talking about earning calls and what that is. And a couple of days back, I was talking about how big publicly traded companies will have earnings calls, and they'll publish their quarterly income statement and balance sheet, the cash flow statements. They'll publish this according to SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission rules, and they publish it for the public to see. And then they will have an earnings call to very carefully talk about whether they missed their numbers or exceeded them, which is kind of objective. It's published. And then more dangerously, forward-looking statements. I'm going to talk about what are we expecting in the future? Are we going to see our sales going up? Buy our stock, sales are going up, or do we think, demand is softening? That's what they're balancing. Well, one of these big companies, I never like to mention the names of companies. It's all public information. You can Google it and find out. But it's a big consumer company that makes, cleaning products and soap and paper and stuff like that. And they were in their public call, their earnings call, talking about concern for slackening demand of the American consumer. And why this is, sometimes companies, there are good quarters and bad quarters with every public company. But what caught my eye was this is a great big, really well-known company that sells a lot of consumable, disposable, consumable, necessary products to we the people, the public. You can be Bill Gates and buy a roll of, paper, hand towels or laundry soap, and you can be you and buy, the same jug of laundry soap. It doesn't matter. What these big consumer companies do is they flatten or democratize the aggregate demand curve, because there are certain things, whether you're Bill Gates or you're, the poorest guy in town, you're still buying the same thing. Okay, so this becomes a real flattener. It's like taking the square root of a curve. It really flattens it out so you can see the data better. And what this company is suggesting is they're concerned, so don't jump off a bridge, but there's a concern that the demand for these consumer products is softening. And that's not a good thing, because what it tells you is that the American consumer, the average American consumer, maybe not Mr. Gates, he probably doesn't think much about the cost of laundry soap. But for the rest of us, we're thinking about the demand for these consumer products. These are necessary standard of living. If you want to live in a cleaner environment than not. If that demand is deteriorating, what it tells you is that the aggregate demand is shifting downward in the United States, and that has to do with the take-home pay phenomenon. People aren't making enough money and taking home enough money to afford a 7% mortgage, which we know. Now, obviously, laundry soap's getting to be a little tight. That's not a good sign. Now, it's not a reason to panic, but what it tells, and also 1 quarter of data does not a trend make. It's one data point on a line. We talk about that. Economists will point data on a line, and you're going to figure out what the slope is. But it's an interesting thing when you get a great big consumables company saying, demand's getting a little slow out there, because it affects their earnings. If their revenues go down and their costs stay the same, that squeezes income, that squeezes earnings per share, and it squeezes return on equity. So what do? Well, we got to lay some people off. We got to sharpen the pencil with our suppliers, which means we're going to try to pay less, or suppliers will have less revenue, and that trickles back. People are losing, a couple of people are laid off, and all of a sudden you're squeezing out another 2% savings on the raw materials. Purchase managers, that's what they do. Then it suggests that has a ripple effect backwards, and it slows the aggregate demand in our economy. And that ultimately reflects in the GDP number, gross domestic product. So we're watching that. And that's why it was an interesting thing. If the demand for luxury watches is softening, you think, well, A, it's a small market, and B, too bad for them. But when laundry soap is starting to slow down, that doesn't suggest that the lifestyle and the quality of life of the average American is in a great shape. So we watch that. Another interesting story. I'm going to take a break here and come right back. I'm over time, so I'll be right back. Give me a minute. Thanks. Bye.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now. And we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
Okay, welcome back. Well, I want to finish up. We talked about the consumers being under stress, and I think that's something that we're really watching, and that's that earnings call comes into it. There's another indicator that came out. It's the job openings, the JOLTS number, published by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it shows again that the number of job openings has softened to 7.4 million jobs, which is down 275,000 jobs from the month before. And while it's not a startling number, and of course nobody's panicking running for the exits, what it does suggest is that the number of job openings in a robust economy would continue to increase a bit rather than contract. Now, if you watch my show every week, you will know it on Thursdays. I call it Unemployment Thursday because back when I was teaching during the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, unemployment was really a big problem. Everybody was cutting staff, especially Wall Street firms, because nobody knew where the dust was going to settle on the financial panic because of the collateralized loan obligations effectively blowing up the banking system to the point where the Fed had to step in with quantitative easing and bail everybody out. So we've been watching these numbers, and what we see is a number of unemployed people going on to the unemployment roll every week has been very stable over the last 2.5 years I'm broadcasting, and that's between 200,000 and 250,000 every week are joining the unemployment rolls, and then people fall off the back or find a job, and the continuing is usually like 1.9. So you think, all right, so you've got 1.9 million people on unemployment, and the jobs report comes out, and it's 7.4 million job openings. We'll say, well, any logical person would say, well, why don't you take the 1.9 million unemployed people and give them part of the 7.4 million jobs? There's plenty of jobs to go around. You'd solve the problem and we'd have perfect employment. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. Obviously, the job over here doesn't help the person way over on the other side of the country. But the point is we watch those numbers carefully, and what we're seeing is a stagnant job market. We're not seeing unemployment going up like 2007 and 2008. We're not seeing that. But what we are seeing is sort of lackluster growth or contraction in the job market, which is effectively stable. And we're seeing the consumers that are struggling with mortgages and, now laundry soap. And what we're seeing is an economy that is blasé. It's just sort of, if you go back to the great Edward Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts, when he decided to run against Jimmy Carter back, in the 70s, it's a malaise, a national malaise. Well, we're kind of in an economic malaise because when we look at the numbers, there is nothing really exciting about the economic numbers. It's not exciting on the downside. We're not in a panic. Certainly nothing exciting about the upside. We're just kind of tooling along in a kind of a boring band. And that's why President Trump has been advocating to Chairman Powell, cut the rates 3 percentage points. Just cut them. Let's unleash the American economy and let's get this thing going. And of course, Chairman Powell it's just amazing what, if you can't get him out by, pressure and dialogue and pressure, I guess you can get him for overbuilding the Federal Reserve building. The point is that's sort of a political back and forth. It's not helpful for the economy, but what would be very helpful, and President Trump is correct, is lower the rates. Now, one of the big problems with lowering the rates is it stimulates, and there's sort of the haves and the have-nots. When we look at the take-home pay of the American public, that's been a real flat line since the 1970s. I mean, if you take a look at the data points on the average take-home pay adjusted for inflation, effectively you're seeing that the American worker is not getting ahead over the last couple of decades or not, but yet prices continue to go up, and that's inflation. Inflation, of course, is driven by the federal government's manic ability to spend $2.5 trillion more than they take in from the tax base. And of course, they sell the debt, and the Federal Reserve has to stabilize that large debt market that's $37 trillion-ish. And they have to be in there stabilizing, and they pump new money in to do it. And that's what's creating the inflation. So the government, through its profligate spending, is creating the inflation that is making more and more things like laundry soap and perhaps, car prices, healthcare prices, housing prices out of reach for more and more American citizens. And why do prices keep going up? Why are there still transactions when the consumer demand is tapped? Shouldn't there be a gap and prices fall back? No, that's what I talked about last week, is the gap is being filled more and more by institutional money and speculative money and short-term rental type money, investment money, and that's filling the gap. So the tax-paying American citizen is being squeezed more and more by institutional. I think that's what President Trump, we had the one big beautiful bill, which is now one big beautiful law. He signed it into law. But the ability to keep more money in Americans' pockets is critical to grow the economy. And the fact the federal government is spending $2.5 trillion more than the people can afford is the federal government's problem, not ours. Problem is we own the federal government and we're letting them do this. And that's why politically we want the American people, the person with the take-home pay, to wake up and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm being left behind. Institutional and foreign buyers are buying all the houses. I can barely buy laundry soap, and I'm paying all the taxes, and the taxes I pay aren't enough to cover the costs. Well, that's crazy. So we need to be thinking about, from the ground up, people saying, wait a minute, we want a government that you tax and you spend. You don't tax, spend, and borrow the rest. You just tax and spend. And you need to put, feet to the fire. So, well, what do you need? Term limits? Well, we have every congressional representative is 2 years. You get to vote for them every 2 years. It's amazing how few of those people are ever defeated in the polls. And it's always because of some scandal. It's never because of, bad economic thought. It's, other scandalous things. So anyway, that's an interesting problem from the American consumer's perspective. I will point out that DOGE, our dear friends at DOGE, have saved over $200 billion this year in identifying fraud and waste, which is great. I mean, it's a great thing. You have a $2.5 trillion deficit. If you subtract the 200, then it's $2.3 trillion deficit. The 200 billion, take that off, it's 2.3 trillion. You got a long way to go to balance the budget. Now, that's not to say saving $200 billion in gross waste and fraud and mismanagement isn't a good thing. It is certainly a good thing, but it just shows you the scope and the magnitude of spending, even in the federal government's ability to spend $2.2 trillion adjusted down for the DOGE savings, $2.2 trillion on stuff that the American people cannot afford to pay. So they borrow the rest. What do? They stick it on a national credit card. And when you think about it, of the $5 trillion that the IRS collects, the Department of Treasury, that's our revenue, 1.2 trillion of that goes to pay interest on the money, the 37 trillion that we spent in the olden days, and we're still paying interest on. So when you tax the people at $5 trillion, you're only getting a little less than, it'll be $3.8 trillion in new money, because you got to pay interest on the old money. It's broken. The whole system's broken. And that's why we're happy to see the DOGE coming through and saving the money. They've got a lot of work to do. And that's something that tends to get institutionalized over time. We watched this back in the Nixon era with Nixon deciding, we're not going to spend all this money. So I don't care if it's, Congress approved it and I signed the bill, I'm not going to spend it. Well, the Supreme Court said, no, you got to spend it. And that's where the commission, it was, I can't remember the name of the commission, but there was a great big study done about federal spending. And that's where the debt ceiling came from. All right, we're going to put a cap on Congress. We can't borrow any more than this, or at least cap on the Treasury. Really blown right past that. Now the debt cap has been increased by $5 trillion under the one big beautiful law. It's never-ending cycle. And until we break that psychology that we are the North Pole and America is Santa Claus, and we can spend as much money as you can possibly dream up on every scheme under the sun, and the people of America are stuck. They're not even overtaxed. You can't raise the taxes because of social blowback. But what you end up doing is you just stick it on the national credit card, and you take more and more of their taxes to pay interest on the debt that's spent. We need a balance in that system. Just like your state government, your local government, your county government, they tax and spend. And if they borrow for a bridge or a highway, that's all calculated into the budget, and it's paid for on a go-forward basis. Because it's okay to fund capital improvements with debt. It's just not okay to fund annual spending on, studying, whatever kooky thing they're studying in, Botswana somewhere. That's not good. And that's why we need discipline. And, frankly, the American system was never designed to be an administrative genius. Okay, it might be a political genius, but Otto von Bismarck does not exist in Washington, D.C. It's not something you're going to see precision administration. We have great corporations in America that are run very well by very sophisticated executives. We don't see that in the public fisc. You don't see it. So it's a real problem. Another interesting thing that came out today is the Case-Shiller index, very well-respected index of housing prices. Been doing this a long time, and if you're an economist or financial analyst, Case-Shiller is a big deal. It's a very important, credible, and very well-respected survey. But it shows that housing prices are down nationally by about 0.3%. And interestingly, how do you reconcile that with the existing home price sales are at the highest? You know, it's a $435,000 median price. So how do you reconcile with home prices down while median prices are up? Well, the interesting thing is when you break into those numbers, what you see is that institutional money continues to push the prices up, but they're not going up as fast as they used to be. So even within that tier of the market, the data suggests that there is a cooling in the demand for housing, in addition to the demand for laundry soap. So we're in an interesting spot in our economy right now. There'll be plenty to watch. I did want to talk about how much electricity, how much capital expenditure in the next 5 years, but I'm out of time, so we're going to do that tomorrow. Anyway, have a great afternoon, and please consider donating to worldviewfoundation.com. And talk to you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.